I want to start by saying that I'm not a person who scares easily. I want to say that. I want it to be true when I say it. And I want you to believe me. Because everything that comes after this is going to sound like the kind of thing a scared person would say. But I wasn't scared, not at first. At first I was just tired. I'm always tired. That's probably the most honest thing I can tell you about myself before we get into any of this. Tired is my baseline. Tired is the water I swim in. I've been working overnight shifts for going on 6 years now, bouncing between whatever security contractor was hiring in the area. And if you've ever worked overnights consistently, you know what I mean when I say that after a while, the fatigue becomes structural. It stops being something that happens to you and starts being something you're built out of. Your eyes adjust to fluorescent light. You learn to sleep through the afternoon. You eat dinner at what normal people call breakfast time, and you stop noticing that your internal clock is running in some other time zone that doesn't correspond to any actual place on the map. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand that when I started noticing things at the Carver, my first instinct was not to investigate. My first instinct was to assume I was wrong, to assume the fatigue was doing something to my perception, smoothing out edges that should have been sharp, blurring things that should have been distinct. That instinct is probably one of the reasons I kept showing up to that job as long as I did. The Carver Extended Stay in Suites, that's the full name, though nobody calls it the full name. The staff called it the Carver. Some of the regular guests, the ones who'd been living out of the same room for months because they were between housing or working a contract job or just preferred the anonymity of a place that doesn't ask many questions, they called it the hotel, like it was the only one for a stretch of time in my life in a very particular and depressing way. It kind of was. It's one of those mid-tier places that sits right off the access road that runs parallel to an interstate about 4 miles from a regional airport. You know the type. 4 floors, exterior access rooms on the lower 2 floors, interior corridors on the upper 2. An indoor pool that's always a degree or two too warm and smells more like chemicals than chlorine. A breakfast area in the lobby that serves hot food until 9 in the morning. Conference rooms on the 2nd floor that companies rent for training days and sales meetings. Vending machine alcoves at the end of every interior corridor. Those kind where the ice machine is recessed into the wall and makes a sound like a diesel engine turning over every time someone uses it. The carpet throughout the interior corridors is a pattern of dark burgundy and forest green that I can only describe as aggressively inoffensive. It's the kind of carpet specifically designed to hide stains, and it succeeds at this, which is a detail I appreciated more as time went on. The lobby is what I'd call an aggressive simulation of comfort. There's a gas fireplace that's never actually on in the warmer months, but is positioned prominently because it photographs well. There are 2 large upholstered chairs near it, positioned at an angle that suggests conversation without actually facing each other. There's a rack of local tourist brochures that hasn't been updated in years, several of which advertise businesses that no longer exist. The security desk is positioned along the back wall of the lobby, past the elevator bank, between a door marked staff only, and a short hallway that leads to the pool. It's not really a desk, it's more of a counter, the kind that was probably originally a secondary check-in station that got repurposed. There's a rolling chair behind it, the kind with armrests that don't stay at the right height no matter how many times you adjust them. There's a monitor, technically 2 monitors on a split mount, that displays the camera feeds. 16 cameras total, 4 exterior, 2 per parking lot area, front and back, 12 interior. The interior cameras cover the lobby, both elevator areas, the pool corridor, the second floor conference room hallway, and a stretch of each interior corridor on floors 3 and 4. The first and second floor exterior access rooms have no interior corridor cameras, just the parking lot coverage. There's a camera mounted in the ceiling of each elevator car too, but those fed to a separate monitor on the front desk that the night auditor could see. And I only had a view of that feed if I walked around to the front desk and looked over their shoulder. My name for these purposes is Marcus. That's not my name, but it's close enough that I'll remember to answer to it if someone asks. I was 31 years old when I started working at the Carver. I'd been doing overnight security work since I was 25, which means I'd spent the better part of my adult life sitting in rooms, very much like that security counter, watching monitors, walking circuits, writing down nothing in logs, and trying to stay awake until the sun came up and the day shift people arrived with their coffee and their conversation and their ability to exist in the world without looking like they'd recently survived something. I got hired at the Carver through an agency the same way I'd gotten most of my recent jobs. The agency placed me with property security contracts, mostly commercial, occasionally residential, and the hotel work paid slightly better than standing in a parking garage for 8 hours, so I'd specifically requested hotel placements when I could. The Carver had been cycling through overnight security workers, the agency told me, which should have been a flag but wasn't. Because honestly, most overnight positions cycle through workers. Nobody is building a career out of this. My first night was in October. I know that because I remember the decorative corn stalks they had flanking the lobby entrance and the little pumpkins on the front desk, and the fact that when I walked in for my orientation, the general manager, a man named Daniel Hoyt, was in the middle of a phone call and held up one finger at me in a way that communicated both acknowledgement and apology simultaneously. He was a compact man in his mid-40s, always wore a collared shirt regardless of the hour, had a habit of straightening things on surfaces as he talked to you. Pens, papers, staplers. He wasn't nervous, or at least that wasn't the impression he gave. It was more like he needed something to do with his hands, or he'd have too much attention available for you. He showed me the security desk, he showed me the monitors. He gave me a printed sheet of procedures that was laminated, which told me these procedures had been shown to enough people that the laminate was worth the investment. He walked me through the hourly circuit check, which required me to physically walk each floor, check all stairwell doors, check the pool gate, check the exterior doors at both ends of the building, and sign my initials in a log at a series of checkpoints that had been designated by small plastic tags drilled into the wall at roughly shoulder height. He told me about the cameras. He said, "You'll notice the system has a quirk." I remember that word specifically, quirk. Like he was telling me about a personality trait. Like the system was a person with an eccentricity worth mentioning. He said the camera system sometimes lost signal briefly overnight. He said it was a known issue with the hardware, something to do with the age of the system and the way it interfaced with the building's electrical infrastructure, and that facilities had looked at it multiple times and hadn't found a solution that the ownership was willing to fund properly. He said if I saw the monitors go to static or drop feeds, not to worry about it, it always came back, and just to note it in the log. I asked how long the outages typically lasted. He said usually just a minute or two, nothing to worry about. I said okay, I was new, I needed the job. I wrote it down in my head as a thing to watch for and moved on. The first 3 nights were completely unremarkable. I did my circuits, I watched the monitors, I noted the occasional guest wandering down to the vending alcove at odd hours, the occasional car pulling into the parking lot and idling for a few minutes before leaving, which happens at every hotel and usually means someone checking their phone or finishing a podcast or whatever. I drank bad coffee from a small machine in the staff break room behind the front desk. I read on my phone. I walked my circuits. I signed my initials at the checkpoints. I watched the sky outside the glass front doors gradually shift from black to dark gray to the particular bruised orange of pre-dawn. And then the day shift came, and I drove home and slept. I didn't see the camera outage until night 4. I almost missed it. I was doing the 2 a.m. circuit, which was one of the required hourly walks, and I'd gotten back to the desk at what I figured was around 2:05. I was logging my completion, which meant writing the time and my initials in the paper log we kept at the desk, when I looked up at the monitors and the feeds were still up. All 16 of them. Nothing unusual. I put the pen down. I looked at my phone. It was 2:06 and some change. And then at 2:07, every feed on both monitors went to static simultaneously. Not one at a time. Not in any sequence. All of them. Like someone had thrown a switch. I sat there for a second looking at the screens. They showed a uniform pattern of gray static, except the static wasn't entirely uniform. It had a faint texture to it, a very slight variation in the grain that made it look almost like depth, like you were looking not at a blank signal but through something. I've thought about that a lot since. Whether it was really just a visual artifact of how the monitors render static or whether I was reading into it something that wasn't there. I don't know. I wrote in the log, camera system signal loss 2:07 a.m. noted for maintenance. And then at approximately 2:09 or 2:10, the feeds came back. All 16 simultaneously again. The same way they dropped. I looked at each feed. The parking lot was empty, the lobby was empty, the elevator areas were empty, the corridors were empty, the pool corridor was empty. Everything was exactly as it should be at 2:10 in the morning in a hotel with maybe 30% occupancy on a Thursday night in October. I noted the return in the log. I drank my coffee. I told myself it was exactly what Hoyt had said it was. A quirk. What I didn't tell myself, what I actively pushed to the side because I didn't have enough information to make it relevant yet, was the feeling I had sitting at that desk in the 2 minutes and change that the cameras were down. Because the building, which was never completely silent, there was always the ventilation hum, always the distant sound of the interstate, always some ambient electrical noise in the walls. The building had felt different during those 2 minutes. Not quieter exactly, different. Like the quality of the silence had changed. Like whatever produces background noise in an occupied building had paused for a breath. I'm sure that's psychosomatic. I'm sure sitting there, watching 16 screens of static at 2 in the morning with no one else visible anywhere, is going to do something to your nervous system, regardless of whether anything's actually wrong. I know that. But I made a note of the feeling anyway. Not in the official log, just in my head. I filed it under the category of things I was paying attention to. The second time the cameras dropped was night 5, 2:07 a.m. exactly. I had my phone in my hand. I was watching the monitors because I've been watching them since 2 o'clock. Waiting without fully admitting to myself that I was waiting. When it happened, I immediately noted the time on my phone, screenshot the display, so I had a record, and sat very still and looked at the static for the duration. The outage lasted until 2:09 a.m., 2 minutes and some seconds. When the feeds came back, I went through each one carefully. The lobby, the elevator areas, the corridors on 3 and 4, the pool corridor, the conference room hallway on 2, the parking lots. Everything looked normal, But I want to describe something carefully because it's the kind of detail that sounds minor when you say it and is actually less minor than it sounds. The camera on the third floor interior corridor, the one positioned near the north end of the hallway, showed a section of carpet stretching from room 318 all the way to the turn toward the elevator. And in that camera's field of view, there was a room service tray on the floor outside room 315. That tray had not been there when the feeds came back from my 1 a.m. circuit check. I had walked that corridor at 1:05 a.m. I know because I signed the checkpoint at 1:06. The hallway was clear. No trays. Guests are asked not to leave trays in the corridor after 11 p.m., which they frequently ignore, but which at least means there's a reason to look for them. When I'd walked the corridor at 1:05, there was no tray outside 315. The cameras had been up from 1:05 until 2:07. No one had come out of room 315 during that time that I'd seen on the monitor. The camera had a clear view of 315's door. But now there was a tray. I walked up to 3 and retrieved the tray. And there was a plastic dome over a plate, which I lifted. There was a half-eaten sandwich and some fries. Standard late-night order. Used napkin, empty ketchup packets. A glass with maybe 2 inches of Coke left. The ice melted down to a few chips. The kind of tray that's been sitting for a while, not a tray that was just set out. I put it in the corridor tray collection area near the elevator. I wrote up the retrieval in the housekeeping notation section of the log because that's what you're supposed to do. I wrote it in a way that didn't raise any flags because I hadn't decided yet what I thought was happening, and I wasn't going to commit to an explanation I couldn't support. I thought, someone in room 315 set out their tray at some point before 1:05 and I simply missed it on my circuit check. I thought, the camera might have had a blind spot at that angle that I hadn't noticed. I thought, you're tired and you're inventing significance where there isn't any. All of these things were plausible. All of these things were the rational first pass explanations for what had happened. I held on to them. But I went back to the desk and I pulled up the camera settings menu and I looked at the configuration for the third floor north corridor camera. I looked at the angle. I ran a quick test by walking to the general area where room 315's door would be in relation to the camera and checking whether my position showed up on the feed. It did. The camera covered the door clearly. I sat back down. I thought about it for a while. Then I thought about the fact that if someone had come out of room 315 while the cameras were down, I wouldn't have seen it. A 2-minute window was enough time to set a tray outside a door and go back inside. That was the simplest explanation. The guest had waited until a weird coincidental moment to set their tray out. And that moment happened to coincide with the camera outage, and I'd missed the tray on my circuit because I was tired and it was late, and sometimes you just miss things. That's what I went with. I went home at 7 a.m. and I slept. And when I came back the next night, I told myself I was going to pay better attention and stop manufacturing mystery out of exhaustion, which is when it started getting harder to rationalize. Night 6. I was doing my pre-outage watch, starting at 2 a.m. I'd set a second phone, an old one I kept as a backup, on the desk, positioned so its camera was pointing at the security monitors. This sounds more extreme than it was. I wasn't doing it because I thought something sinister was happening. I was doing it because I wanted documentation if I needed to make a case to facilities about the camera issue. That's the reason I gave myself. At 2:07 a.m., the feeds dropped. I noted the time on both phones. I sat and watched the static. I had started counting during the outage, a quiet mental count at Just to have a sense of the duration, I counted to about 130 before the feeds came back, which would be roughly 2 minutes and 10 seconds, consistent with the previous outage. When the feeds came back, I looked at each one in order. Lobby, elevator 3, elevator 4, third floor north corridor, third floor south corridor, fourth floor north corridor, fourth floor south corridor, pool corridor, conference corridor, parking lots. I stopped on the fourth floor south corridor. There was a man standing in the corridor. He was standing approximately halfway down the hall, near the ice machine alcove at the south end of the fourth floor. He was wearing what looked like business casual clothes, dark slacks, and a light-colored dress shirt. No jacket. He was standing facing the alcove, not moving, back to the camera. This by itself is not alarming. Guests sometimes stand in corridors. People get ice at 2 o'clock in the morning. People pace when they can't sleep. What made me look at this man and feel something slowly go wrong in my chest was not his presence in the corridor, but the way he was standing. He was standing completely still, not the stillness of someone who has just arrived and is about to do something. The stillness of someone who has been standing in that spot for a while and is not planning to do something. The particular frozen quality of a person who is waiting without any of the small body language that accompanies waiting. No shifting of weight, no checking a phone, no looking around. I watched him for about 3 minutes. He did not move. Then I picked up the phone and went to check. By the time I got to the fourth floor south corridor, which took me maybe 4 minutes to get to from the security desk by taking the stairs rather than waiting for the elevator, the corridor was empty. I walked the full length of it. I checked the ice machine alcove. I checked both stairwell doors at each end. All closed, no indication anyone had just passed through. I came back down. I looked at the camera feed on the monitor. The fourth floor south corridor was empty. I sat there with my hands flat on the desk and breathed for a minute. Then I went through the possibilities. The man was a guest who had gone to get ice and returned to his room before I got there. This was plausible. 4 minutes is enough time. But he'd been standing completely still, and the ice machine is loud enough that you'd hear it from that end of the corridor if someone was using it, and I'd heard nothing on my way up the stairwell. The man was a guest who had taken the elevator down to another floor while I was coming up the stairs. Possible. I hadn't taken the elevator. We might have missed each other. I hadn't actually seen a man at all. I'd seen a shape in the static or a visual artifact in the feed when it came back on, and interpreted it as a human figure because my brain was primed for that kind of pattern recognition at 2 in the morning. I went back and looked at the secondary phone's recording of the monitor. The footage was small and at an angle, and the resolution of an old phone recording a monitor in a dimly lit room is not high. But I could see the shape. A standing shape at the end of the corridor. You could argue it was a shadow. You could argue it was an anomaly in the feed during the first few seconds after the signal restored. I could not argue it away completely, but I could file it in the category of inconclusive and leave it there. I did not report it to management. I went home. I slept badly. I want to pause here and say something about what the job is like, because I think it matters for understanding why I made the decisions I made over the following weeks. When you're overnight security at a place like the Carver, your relationship with management is specific and a little asymmetrical. They need someone in the building overnight for legal reasons, for insurance reasons, and because occasionally something actually requires a response. But they do not want that person to create situations. The ideal overnight security worker, from management's perspective, is someone who fills the seat, keeps a log that says everything was fine, and doesn't generate incidents that require documentation, corporate notification, or guest complaints. I'd worked enough of these jobs to understand the unspoken contract. You are here to represent the presence of security, not to enact it too vigorously. A security worker who writes up weird incidents and asks pointed questions is a liability. A security worker who logs routine and nothing else is an asset. So when I debated whether to mention the standing man on the 4th floor to Hoyt, I weighed it against the fact that I couldn't prove the man had done anything wrong, couldn't prove there was an actual incident, and could only say that I had seen a guest standing very still in a corridor and gone to check on it and found the corridor empty. That's not an incident, that's a ghost story, and ghost stories don't go over well with people like Daniel Hoyt. So I didn't mention it. What I did do, starting on night 7, was begin keeping a separate personal log, not the official one, my own. I had a small notebook, the kind with a black cover, that I kept in my jacket pocket. I started writing down everything I noticed. Timed, dated, everything, however small. Night 7 was a Saturday, which meant the hotel was closer to capacity. Occupancy was probably 60 or 70%, which meant real foot traffic in the corridors. Elevators operating on a more regular basis, more cars in the parking lot, more ambient noise in the building. Saturdays are easier to get through on overnight because the building feels alive in a way it doesn't on a Wednesday. The cameras dropped at 2:07 a.m. I noted the time. I watched the static. I counted. I counted to 160 before the feeds returned, longer than before by maybe half a minute. I noted this. When the feeds came back, I checked each one. On the 3rd floor north corridor, there was a woman standing outside the elevator. She was facing the elevator doors. She was holding a key card in one hand and a small plastic cup, the kind you get from the ice machine, in the other. She was waiting for the elevator. Normal. Completely normal. The elevator arrived. She got in. The elevator indicator light on the lobby camera showed her descending to the 2nd floor. I tracked her on the 2nd floor corridor camera. She walked to room 218 and used her key card to enter. That's it. That's the whole thing. A guest getting ice at 2:10 a.m. But here's what I wrote in my notebook because I was being thorough. The woman was wearing a light blue bathrobe over what looked like pajamas, and she had no shoes on. Her feet were bare on the corridor carpet. This is normal. The thing I wrote in my notebook was that I hadn't seen her in the corridors at any point during the night, and she was in room 218, which is on the 2nd floor, which has no interior corridor camera. And the ice machine for that floor is in the exterior access section, not the interior corridor. To get to the interior ice machine, she would have had to come from the 2nd floor, through the stairwell or the elevator to the 3rd floor. It's possible she just preferred that ice machine. Hotels are full of people doing mildly irrational things at 2 a.m. I noted it and moved on. I noted something else on that shift that I haven't mentioned yet because I want to get to it in the right order. The hotel had 5 floors. I've told you about floors 1 through 4. The 5th floor is the thing I want to get to. But I need to get there at the right pace because the way I discovered what I'm going to tell you about is important. On the first night during Hoyt's orientation, I had been given access to all 4 occupied floors for my circuit check. He had walked me through the route. Ground floor, exterior doors, pool gate, stairwells. Second floor, interior corridor, checkpoint tag near the elevator. Third floor, same. Fourth floor, same. He did not mention a fifth floor. The Carver is a 4-story building. That's what its exterior looks like. That's what the elevator panel shows. 4 buttons. L for lobby. 2, 3, 4. That's it. I had not thought about whether there was a 5th floor because there was no reason to. The building looked like a 4-story building. I found out about the 5th floor on night 11 because I was doing my circuit check on the 4th floor and I took the wrong stairwell. The Carver has 2 interior stairwells, one at each end of the building on each floor, and an external fire stairwell on the south side. I had been taking the north interior stairwell for my circuits because it was closer to the elevator bank. On night 11, I went to the south stairwell instead because I'd gone to check something at the south end of the 4th floor corridor, and it was quicker to take the south stairs back down. I pushed open the south stairwell door on 4 and started down. And I saw that the stairwell continued upward. There was one more landing above the 4th floor door. One more flight of stairs. At the top was a landing with a steel door. The door was gray painted steel, heavier than the other stairwell doors, with a push bar handle. It had a card reader mounted to the wall beside it, the same type as the room card readers, and a small laminated sign taped to the door that said, "Mechanical and storage, authorized personnel only." I stood there and looked at it for a moment. Then I thought, of course, a mechanical floor. A lot of mid-rise hotels have a dedicated mechanical floor for HVAC systems, water systems, electrical distribution. It makes sense that it would be above the guest floors. It made sense that it wouldn't be on the elevator. It made sense that I hadn't been shown it during orientation because it wasn't part of my circuit. I went back down the stairs and finished my circuit. But on the next night, I looked at the security desk from a different angle, literally turned my chair around and looked at the space behind me. And I found something I hadn't paid attention to because it had just been background to me. On the wall behind the security desk, above the row of filing cabinets, there was a cable management panel. The kind of thing you'd see in any building that has a structured wiring installation. Several cables running into and out of it, neatly bundled and labeled with small tags, the kind of tags where you write on a paper insert and slide it behind a clear plastic window. I looked at the labels. Most of them said what you'd expect. Lobby Cam 1, Lobby Cam 2, 3rd floor north, 3rd floor south, 4th floor north, 4th floor south, elevator A, elevator B, pool, core R, and so on. But there were 2 cables on the right side of the panel that were labeled differently. One said 5F-A, the other said 5F-B. They were connected to the same cable management panel as all the other camera system cables, but they were not connected to any monitor I could see. The cables ran from the panel into the wall conduit and disappeared. I sat down slowly. I thought, there are cameras on the 5th floor. Or there were cameras on the 5th floor, and they're either disconnected or they feed somewhere I'm not looking. I thought, there's a 5th floor with cameras in a mechanical storage space that I've never been shown and that has no elevator access. I thought, there's a mechanical and storage floor in a mid-tier hotel near an airport that has apparently had a camera installation at some point. I wrote all of this in my notebook. I dated it and timed it. Then I went back to looking at the camera panel labels and I noticed something else I should tell you about right now because it compounds the other thing I just told you. The cables for the camera system were neatly bundled and labeled, and I could roughly trace them by following the labels to where the cables went into the conduit. Most of them went into the conduit that ran toward the monitors. the two cables labeled 5F-A and 5F-B did not go in the direction of the monitors. They went into a separate conduit that ran along the bottom of the panel and disappeared into the wall in a direction that I could only roughly estimate, but which seemed to run toward the front of the building, toward the front desk area, toward wherever the night auditor sat. I was on shift with the night auditor, a woman named Paulette, who was in her 50s and had been at the Carver for something like 8 years. She was a steady, quiet woman who did her work with the efficiency of someone who has done it so many times that it no longer requires conscious attention. She was perfectly friendly to me, but not particularly interested in conversation after the first few nights, which was fine. I didn't need conversation. I needed quiet. But the next night, I found a reason to spend some time near the front desk. I said the printer I used for logging was out of paper and asked if I could use the front desk supply. Paulette got up and went to the back room to get a ream, and while she was gone, I looked at the front desk setup. There were 2 monitors on the front desk. One was the hotel management system, the reservations and billing software. The other was the elevator camera monitor I'd been told about during orientation. But there was a third monitor. It was pushed to the far end of the desk, partially behind the decorative foliage arrangement that they kept at the corner of the front desk counter. It was turned off, or not exactly turned off. The screen was dark, but there was a small green LED at the bottom corner that indicated it was powered. I did not have time to do anything else before Paulette came back with the paper. I thanked her. I took the paper. I went back to my desk. But I knew what I'd seen. And I thought about those cables. The ones labeled 5F-A and 5F-B. And the monitor at the front desk that was dark but powered. And I thought about how Paulette, in 8 years at the Carver working nights, would have been sitting at that desk every time the cameras dropped at 2:07 a.m. Every single time. I'd never seen her get up and look around during a camera outage, not once. She just kept doing whatever she was doing at her desk like nothing had happened. I started paying attention to her during the 2:07 window. The next 3 nights, I made a point of being near the lobby, or at least somewhere that I could see the front desk, before 2:07. The cameras dropped at 2:07 each time, consistent, like clockwork, like the building had it scheduled. And each time Paulette did not react, did not look up at the monitor, did not pick up the phone, did not show any indication that 16 security cameras had just simultaneously lost their feeds. She just sat there, typing, looking at her screen. On the 3rd night of watching her, I watched her for the entire duration of the outage. And I caught the moment when the feeds came back, because the little indicator light on the security monitors on my desk flickered when the signal restored. When that light flickered, Paulette turned her head very slightly toward the dark monitor at the end of her desk. Not enough to look directly at it, just a slight turn, like she'd registered something, like something had communicated itself to her and she was acknowledging it the way you acknowledge a sound you were expecting to hear. Then she turned back to her work. I noted it in my notebook. There was a maintenance worker at the Carver named Roy who came in 3 days a week, typically Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, working a mid-afternoon to midnight shift. I overlapped with him on Saturday nights by about an hour or 2 before he clocked out. Roy was the kind of maintenance person who is extremely competent but operates on a very specific frequency of conversation, which is to say he would talk to you comfortably about things in the world that were not the Carver and would become noticeably less conversational when the topic turned to the property itself. I started finding reasons to talk to Roy on the Saturday shifts when I could. Casual conversation near the break room, the kind where you're both getting coffee and talking about nothing in particular. Sports, weather, the price of gas. Roy was good at that kind of conversation. He had the easy warmth of someone who genuinely likes people in a general sense and is genuinely uninterested in being close to any specific one of them. It took me 3 Saturdays to bring up the camera system in a way that didn't feel like I was asking directly about it. I mentioned that I'd noticed the outages at night and that I'd been trying to figure out if there was a pattern just because I was bored and it gave me something to think about on the overnight. I made it sound like a puzzle I was idly working. Roy's response was exactly what I expected from Roy. He nodded. He looked at his coffee. He said, "Yeah, that's a known thing." I said, "Did you ever look into it? Like, what causes it?" He said, "Facilities looked at it a while back. It's a system thing. Old hardware." I said, "They couldn't fix it?" He said, "Budget thing." And he finished his coffee and put the cup in the break room sink and said he had to go check on something on 3 and he would see me later. I watched him leave. I thought about the way he'd looked at his coffee when I asked the question. Not at me, at the coffee. I think about that a lot. The next significant thing happened on a night that was about 3 weeks into my employment at the Carver. It was a Wednesday, so the hotel was at lower occupancy, maybe 25%. I'd done my 2 a.m. circuit, came back to the desk, and was watching the monitors. 2:07. The feeds dropped. I was counting. I got to 150, 170, 200. At 200, the feeds had not come back. I kept counting. At 230, roughly, the feeds came back. Almost 4 minutes. Longer than any previous outage. I wrote the duration in my notebook with emphasis, underlining it twice. When the feeds came back, I checked each one in order. I got to the 4th floor north corridor camera and stopped. There was a luggage cart in the corridor, the kind used by housekeeping for linen transport. A large rectangular wire frame cart with a canvas bag mounted in the center. It was parked against the wall between rooms 412 and 414. This was wrong for several reasons. The first reason was that it was 2:15 in the morning, and housekeeping does not operate at 2:15 in the morning. The second reason was that the housekeeping carts are stored in the housekeeping room on each floor at the end of every shift, and the housekeeping room on 4 is behind a door with a keypad. The third reason is that the cart was in the corridor when the feeds came back, but it had not been there during any point of the night that the cameras had been operational. I would have seen it on the corridor camera. I went upstairs. I took the stairs quickly, almost running, which I don't now unusually. Being in a hotel at 2 in the morning is the kind of thing that wakes guests and generates complaints. The 4th floor north corridor was empty. No cart. I stood in the middle of the corridor and looked both ways. Nothing. I went to the housekeeping room, which had a keypad. The door was closed. I didn't have the code for the keypad. That was housekeeping department access. But I put my hand on the door and pushed slightly. The door was firmly closed and locked. No indication it had been recently opened. I went back to the desk and looked at the camera. The corridor was empty. I thought, you're doing this again. You're seeing things in the first few seconds of a restored feed that aren't there, or that are visual artifacts. But I'd been clear. The cart had been clear. I'd looked at it for probably done 10 seconds before going upstairs. I wrote it in my notebook. That same night, around 4 a.m., I was doing my 4 o'clock circuit on the 3rd floor when I heard something. It took me a moment to locate the direction because the corridor's acoustic properties bounce sound a little. But it was coming from above me, from the 4th floor. A low, repetitive sound. It was rolling, like something with wheels moving along a hard floor. Not carpet, hard floor. I stood still and listened to it for maybe 15 seconds. It was rhythmic and slow, moving from what I estimated was the north end to the south end of whatever space I was hearing it from. Then it stopped. I went up to 4. Empty corridor, carpeted, quiet. Above 4 is 5. The mechanical and storage floor. I went to the south stairwell and climbed to the 5th floor landing. I stood at the steel door with the push bar and the card reader. I put my ear near the seam of the door. Silence. I stood there for a long time, maybe 3 minutes. I was aware that I was standing at a locked door to a floor I wasn't authorized to be on at 4 in the morning, listening at the door seam, and that this would not be a great thing to explain to anyone who found me there. I went back down. The rolling sound had been HVAC. It had been a ventilation duct expanding or contracting. It had been something in the building's mechanical systems that I had no basis to identify and every reason to attribute to the building's age and the Carver's general state of deferred maintenance. I went back to my desk. I sat. I was aware that my hands were cold, despite the lobby being kept at a consistent temperature that bordered on too warm. I looked at my notebook. In 3 weeks of working at the Carver, the camera system had experienced an outage at 2:07 a.m. every single night, without exception. The duration of the outages had been increasing, though not in a perfectly linear progression. The first outages had been roughly 2 minutes. The most recent had been nearly 4. After each outage, there had been at least one thing I couldn't explain. Not a dramatic thing, not a supernatural thing, just a thing that hadn't been there before the cameras went down and was there after, or had been there before and was gone after, or that involved a person in a place I couldn't account for. The cameras had never gone down at any other time during the night, only at 2:07, always at 2:07, every night. Management knew about it and had told me it was a known quirk. Paulette, who had been sitting at the front desk during every one of these outages for 8 years, reacted to the end of each outage with a slight turn of her head toward a dark monitor that was connected to cameras on a 5th floor that didn't officially exist on the elevator panel. I put my notebook down and looked at the security monitors for a long time. Then I thought about what I was actually going to do with any of this. The thing about working a job like mine is that the obvious adult sensible response to believing something strange is happening at your place of employment is to report it to management. That's the protocol. You observe something unusual, you document it, you report it through appropriate channels. But the appropriate channel was Daniel Hoyt. And Daniel Hoyt had stood across from me on my first night and told me the camera outages were a known quirk, which meant that either he genuinely didn't know what I was telling you I'd been observing, in which case I had to convince him that the known quirk was more than a quirk, or he did know, in which case his framing of it as a known quirk was a deliberate containment of information and going to him with what I knew was not going to help me. The third possibility is the one I spent the least time on because it was the most uncomfortable, which is that the hotel had some kind of actual problem that management was aware of, that the outages and what happened during them were connected to that problem, and that everyone at the Carver above a certain pay grade was simply accustomed to it. Not covering it up in an active conspiratorial sense, Just normalize to it. The way you become normalized to a leak in your roof that you've been meaning to fix for years. It's there. It happens. You put a bucket down and you stop thinking about it. What I needed, I decided, was more information before I decided anything else. I needed to understand what the camera logs actually showed over a longer time period. Whether the outages were documented consistently in the official log, and whether there was any pattern in the guest or staff behavior that I'd been observing beyond what I'd already recorded. The official security log was a paper binder kept at the security desk. I had access to it because I wrote in it every night. But the binder I'd been given when I started only went back to the first week of October, roughly when I started. The previous logs had to be stored somewhere. I asked Paulette about it on a Friday night casually around midnight. I said something about wanting to review the camera outage history to see if there was a recurring pattern I could include in a maintenance request, hoping that gave me a plausible administrative reason for asking. She told me the old logs were in the filing room off the security desk. The door marked staff only. I had a key to that room. It was on my key ring, the standard key set they'd given me during orientation, and I'd assumed it was a supply room. I'd opened it once in the first week to look for printer paper and found shelves with office supplies and a filing cabinet in the corner that I hadn't given much thought to. That filing cabinet. On a slow Monday night around 3 a.m., with about 12 guests in the building and nothing moving on any camera, I went into the filing room and spent the better part of an hour going through that cabinet. The security logs went back 14 months. I don't know if that was all they had, or just what fit in the cabinet. Each log was a monthly binder dated on the spine. I started with the log from 6 months ago and worked backward, looking specifically for any notation about camera outages. They were there. Every single month. Notes in different handwriting because different people had been working the overnight in the preceding year, all noting the same thing in slightly different language. Camera signal loss 0207. Back within minutes. Cameras offline brief 0207 return to service. System outage 2:07 a.m. Logged for maintenance. One notation that said simply, cameras again 0207. The outages were in every single log going back 14 months to the oldest one I could find. They were documented consistently in the appropriate section of the log, and in every case were documented the same way. Brief outage, return to service, noted for maintenance. In not a single log entry did any previous overnight security worker note what happened during the outage or after it. Just the outage itself. Just the time and the return. Until I found an entry from 7 months ago in a binder marked with initials I didn't recognize, in handwriting that was slightly larger and less tidy than the entries around it, as if the person had been writing faster or with less care. The entry read, camera outage 0207, approximately 3 minutes. Cameras back 0210. Checked corridors. Guest on 3rd floor south near 312. Woman in gray did not make contact. Noted for review. And the next entry from that same writer, 2 nights later. Camera 0207 again. 4 minutes this time. Checked 4th floor per previous. Door to south stairs on 4 was warm to touch, not forced. Logged for Roy to check heating system on upper levels. And one more entry, which appeared to be that same person's last entry in the binder, dated 3 nights after the second one. Asked DH about camera thing. He says it's always been this way. Says it's the building. Says to just log it and move on. Starting to think I should log it somewhere else. After that entry, there were 4 or 5 days where the overnight log had been signed by someone with different initials, suggesting a different worker had covered those shifts. Then the handwriting changed entirely, and the new person's entries were clean and brief and said nothing about camera outages except the standard brief notation. I photographed every relevant entry with my phone. I put the binders back exactly as I'd found them. I went back to the security desk. I sat there and thought about that last entry, starting to think I should log it somewhere else. The person who wrote that had clearly been thinking the same things I was thinking. They'd asked Hoyt about it and gotten the same answer I would have gotten, and then they'd stopped being the overnight security worker at the Carver. I went through the sign-in log for the overnight shift, which was also in the filing room, and found the name that matched the period I was looking at. The name was Kevin Spire. He had worked at the Carver for 43 nights before his name stopped appearing in the sign-in log. I had no way of knowing why he'd left. People leave jobs for 100 different reasons, and most of them are not interesting. He could have gotten a better offer. He could have moved. He could have just stopped showing up, which is not uncommon in this industry. But I thought about what he'd written. The guest in gray near 312. The door on 4 that was warm to touch. The conversation with Hoyt. I thought about the door to the 5th floor and whether I could describe it as warm. I hadn't put my hand flat against it. I'd put my ear near the seam. I hadn't been thinking about temperature. I decided that on my next circuit check, I was going to put my hand on the 5th floor door. I did it 2 nights later on a Thursday during the 3 a.m. circuit. I went up the south stairs to the 5th floor landing. I put my palm flat against the door. It was warm, not hot, not alarmingly so, but noticeably warmer than the stairwell air and warmer than the door on any of the other floors. A gentle, even warmth, like a surface that has been consistently above ambient temperature for a long time. Mechanical floors are warm. The equipment on them generates heat. This is completely explainable, but I held my hand there for a moment and I thought about something, which is that the HVAC equipment for a building generates heat in operation, yes, but it doesn't necessarily generate even heat in a way that would make an insulated steel door consistently warm to the touch from the stairwell side. The warmth would have to be coming from inside the space and pressing against the door from the other side, which meant whatever was generating heat in there was generating it in a quantity sufficient to warm the door from within, or it meant the heating system on that floor was miscalibrated and running warmer than it should. Also completely explainable. I took my hand off the door and went back down. The outage on that night was 5 minutes and 20 seconds. I timed it precisely. When the feeds came back, I went through all 16 cameras in order and stopped on the 3rd floor south corridor. There was a woman near room 312. She was in a gray robe, and she was standing with her back to the camera, facing the door of room 312. Her hair was dark, shoulder length, and she was holding something against the door. Her hand, or possibly an object. I couldn't tell at that resolution. She stood there for about 4 seconds after the feed came back, and then she pushed off the door and walked toward the south elevator. She pressed the button. The elevator came. She got in. I checked the elevator camera feed on the security monitors, not the front desk one, but the corridor angle that shows the elevator doors. She got on the elevator. The elevator indicator light in the lobby camera went dark, which indicated the elevator was moving. It did not stop on any of the corridor floors that I could see from my camera feeds. The lobby camera showed the elevator light illuminate. meaning it had returned to the lobby level. But the lobby camera showed an empty lobby, exiting the elevator. I stood up from my desk. I looked at the lobby camera for a full 60 seconds. The elevator doors were visible in the lobby camera's field of view. They were closed. The indicator above the elevator showed L. No one had come out. I walked out from behind the security desk and stood in the lobby. The elevator was right there. The doors closed. The indicator showing L for lobby. I pressed the call button. The doors opened. The elevator car was empty. No one in it. I looked at the lobby. I walked the perimeter. There was no one there. This is the point in my account where I need to be very honest about my internal state, because I don't want to dramatize it and I don't want to understate it. What I felt was not quite fear. It was a very specific kind of cognitive discomfort. The feeling of holding two things that cannot both be true at the same time and not having enough information to resolve which one is wrong. Either the woman had come out of the elevator and I had failed to see her on the lobby camera and she had gone somewhere in the lobby that the camera couldn't see. Maybe into the restroom off the lobby, maybe into the conference corridor. Possible. Or the elevator had not gone to the lobby level despite the indicator showing L. Or I was wrong about what I'd seen on the corridor camera and the lobby camera. I was wrong about the direction of travel or the floor or the timing or some combination. I went back to the desk. I sat down. After about 10 minutes, I heard the elevator ding. I looked at the lobby camera. The elevator doors opened and a man in a hotel bathrobe stepped out, went to the breakfast area, got a bottle of water from the self-serve refrigerator that guests have access to overnight, and went back to the elevator. He pressed 4. He went up. Just a guest. Just a completely normal guest, getting water at 3 a.m, stepping out of the same elevator that had just, by my observation, failed to produce the woman in gray that I'd watched get into it. I thought, the indicator was wrong. The elevator had stopped on a floor I couldn't see the indicator for. I thought, you're tired, and the fatigue is doing what fatigue does, which is knit things together into patterns that aren't really there. I wrote it all in my notebook anyway. The woman near 312, the elevator, the lobby, everything. Here's what I should tell you at this point, because it formed a kind of backdrop to everything I've been describing. The Carver's 5th floor is not the kind of secret that no one knows about. In a hotel, there's always information that circulates among staff that doesn't make it into any official document. The housekeeping staff, the maintenance staff, the front desk staff all exist in a kind of quiet parallel information network that overnight security workers are only tangentially connected to. I was tangentially connected to it through Paulette and through a daytime front desk worker named Sandra, who came in at 7 and who I sometimes overlapped with for the end of my shift. Sandra was younger than Paulette, probably early 30s, and more inclined to casual conversation in the way that people who work days are, because the days are less isolating. Sandra had been at the Carver for about 2 years when I got there. She knew the building the way day shift staff know a building, practically and socially. She knew which elevator was slower. She knew which vending machine ate quarters. She knew which regulars wanted their same room and which ones didn't care. I spent about 2 weeks calibrating how to bring up the 5th floor with Sandra. I did it finally on a Thursday morning when we were both at the front desk. Me wrapping up my log and her getting started on the morning prep. I asked her in the context of a conversation about the building's layout and which areas were being renovated, whether she knew what was on the top floor of the building. She said, without missing a beat, "Storage." I said, "Have you ever been up there?" She said, "No, nobody goes up there. It's just maintenance storage, old furniture, stuff like that." I said, "Do you know if they've always had it closed off?" She looked at me for a fraction of a second longer than the question warranted. Not long, not dramatically, just a fraction. And then she said, "I think so. I think it was never a guest floor. Why?" I said, "Just curious about the building layout. The elevator only goes to 4. She said, "Yeah, it's not accessible to guests. It's just storage." And she went back to her prep, and that was the end of it, the fraction of a second look. That's what I wrote in my notebook. That's all it was, a look, a tiny pause in the rhythm of normal conversation, but I had been observing human behavior in institutional settings for 6 years, and I had developed a decent sensor for when a response was slightly too smooth, slightly too quickly arrived at. The response was shaped, not given. The way a person shapes a response when they have a different answer available but have decided not to use it. Maybe I'm wrong. Sandra may genuinely believe it's just storage. She probably has no more actual knowledge of what's on that floor than I do. But someone had given her at some point a clean and satisfying version of what the 5th floor was, and she'd accepted it. And that clean version was what she had ready. 3 nights later, at 2:07 a.m., the cameras dropped again. The outage lasted 7 minutes. 7 minutes and some seconds. When the feeds came back, I noticed something I had not seen in any previous outage recovery. On the 4th floor north corridor camera, there was a smear on the lens. The kind of smear you get when something has touched the camera housing up close, near the glass of the lens. It was at the lower right of the frame, a soft blur that occluded about 15% of the image. Camera lenses get dirty. This was not unusual in itself, but on my 2 a.m. circuit 45 minutes earlier, that camera had been clean. I had developed a habit of looking at each camera's image quality at the start of each circuit, partly because it gave me something to actually attend to during the rounds, and the North 4 camera had been fine. Someone had touched that camera during the outage. I went up to 4 with a lens cloth from the supply room. I stood on my tiptoes to reach the camera housing, which was mounted near the ceiling. I cleaned the lens, and while I was up there close to the camera, I could see that the housing had a slight displacement from its mount. Not enough that you'd notice from the ground, but it had been turned slightly from its calibrated angle. Someone had touched the camera, someone had put their hands on the housing and moved it, and the motion had left a smear on the lens. I straightened it as best I could. I looked at the feed on my phone, which I'd been using to check the live feed while I worked on the camera. The corridor looked normal. I went back downstairs and sat at the desk and looked at the monitors. I realized sitting there at 2:30 in the morning on a Thursday what I was actually afraid of. Not what was happening during the 2:07 outages, not who was in the corridors or what they were doing or what was on the 5th floor. I was afraid that the camera in the 4th floor north corridor had been moved so that its field of view was subtly different, so that there was now something in that corridor or some area of that corridor that it could no longer see, or so that it was now pointing somewhere it hadn't been pointing before. I spent 10 minutes trying to figure out, purely by comparing the live feed to my memory of the previous feed, whether the angle had changed enough to matter. My memory wasn't good enough to be certain. I didn't have comparison footage because my phone's secondary camera had only been recording the lobby cameras, not the corridor feeds. I noted it. I moved on. The next night, I came in early enough to look at the fourth floor north corridor camera feed during the relatively well-documented period of the late afternoon, and I made a deliberate mental note of where the frame cut off on the east side of the image. Specifically, I noted that the door to room 406 was at the very far right edge of the frame, mostly cut off, with only the door hinges and a sliver of the door visible. The following morning when I came in, I looked at the camera feed again. Room 406's door hinges were now not visible. The frame cut off at the wall just before room 406's door. The camera had been moved during the 207 outage. The angle had been shifted, a small shift, maybe 2 or 3 degrees, but consistent, deliberate, the same direction both times. Whatever was being pointed away from room 406, it was working. I could no longer see room 406's door from the security desk. Now I had to go look at room 406. This is the part that took the most out of me. In terms of crossing a line, I'd been carefully not crossing. I was an overnight security worker. My access to guest rooms was emergency access only. I had a master key, yes, but using it on a guest room without cause was the kind of thing that could get me fired and potentially worse, depending on what I found and how the guest in that room felt about it. What I told myself was that I was doing a welfare check, and that the unusual camera activity near room 406 constituted reasonable grounds for a welfare check under the hotel's safety policy. This was a legal gray area, but it was a gray area I could work with. I did my 2 a.m. circuit. I went to the 4th floor north corridor. I stood in front of room 406 and I listened for a moment. Nothing. No TV sounds. No movement, no voices. I knocked. The standard knock. 3 short raps followed by security. I waited 15 seconds and knocked again. No response. I used the master key. Room 406 was empty. Not just unoccupied for the night empty, actually empty. The bed was made with the housekeeping covers, the kind they put on rooms that aren't in rotation. The tight, flat tuck with no turned-back corner. The closet was empty. No toiletries in the bathroom. The TV remote was in its little paper sleeve on the nightstand. Room 406 was out of service. But here's the thing about an out-of-service room. It should have a door hanger or a housekeeping notation that says so. It should appear in the hotel management system as blocked. There should be a reason it's not in rotation. I didn't have access to the hotel management system to check the room's status, but I could check one thing. Near the phone on the nightstand, there was the standard room information folder, the kind with the Wi-Fi password and the checkout time and the list of services. I opened it. Inside, along with the standard materials, there was a small maintenance log card, the kind facilities uses to track work done in a room. These cards come with the room when it's taken out of service and are removed when it's put back into rotation. The maintenance log card for room 406 showed the last entry from 4 months ago. The reason given: plumbing inspection pending. Pending for 4 months. I put the card back. I walked to the window and looked out. The parking lot from this vantage showed mostly empty spaces, a few cars, the parking lot lights, against the low cloud cover. Rain had been threatening all night, and the sky had that flat, pressurized look that means weather is coming. I stood there for a moment, and I thought about what I knew, laid out in order. Every night at 2:07 a.m., the camera system drops for an increasing duration. The outage is documented as a known quirk. It has been happening for at least 14 months, based on the logs I found. Possibly longer. I had no data before that. During these outages, people and objects appear in or disappear from locations that the cameras cover. I have observed this inconsistently, meaning not every outage produces an obvious post-outage anomaly, but enough of them do that the pattern seems deliberate rather than coincidental. The 5th floor of the building is sealed and listed as mechanical and storage, but is connected to the camera system via 2 cables that feed to a monitor at the front desk that Paulette is aware of. The camera in the north corridor on this floor has been progressively adjusted during outages to remove room 406 from its field of view. Room 406 has been out of service for 4 months for a plumbing inspection that is not concluded. A previous overnight security worker named Kevin Spire documented similar observations, asked management about the camera situation, received the same answer I received, and left the position shortly after. I left room 406 and went back to my desk. I sat there and I looked at the monitors and I thought, this is the moment where a person who is making good decisions walks away. This is the moment where you understand that you are in a situation that has institutional depth, that has been this way for longer than you've been here, that everyone around you has accommodated to, and that you, specifically you, do not have enough information to safely navigate. The person who makes good decisions finishes their shift, goes home, and starts looking for another placement through the agency. I went back to looking at the monitors. The rain started around 3:30. I could hear it on the glass front doors of the lobby, a soft static that layered over the ventilation hum and the occasional distant sound from the interstate. Rain in a hotel lobby at 3:30 in the morning is a particular sound. It makes the lobby feel like the inside of a very large, very quiet container, like the building has sealed itself off from everything outside. There was a guest in the lobby around 4 a.m. He had not come through the front doors, because I would have seen him enter on the lobby camera. He simply appeared in the lobby the way people appear in places when you're not watching every single moment, which is to say I looked at the lobby camera and he was there, sitting in one of the 2 upholstered chairs near the unlit gas fireplace. He was a middle-aged man, somewhere between 50 and 60, wearing dark dress pants and a dark collared shirt and what looked like dress shoes. He was sitting back in the chair with his hands on the armrests, not reading anything, not looking at a phone, just sitting, looking toward the front doors. This was unusual but not alarming. Guests sometimes can't sleep and come down to the lobby. It happens. What kept my attention was that he sat like that for over an hour. I watched the lobby camera intermittently throughout my circuit, and each time I came back to it, he was in the same position, in the same chair, looking toward the front doors. At 5:10 a.m., he stood up. He stood up with the deliberate, unhurried movement of a person who had finished a task and was ready to leave the space. Not the slow movement of someone who had been sitting for a long time and whose body was reminding them of that. Just standing, like standing up at the conclusion of a meeting. He walked to the elevator. He pressed the button. The elevator came. He got in. I watched the corridor cameras on each floor for indication of where he got off. The elevator indicator lights on my camera feeds were difficult to read, but I thought I saw activity on 4. On the 4th floor north corridor camera, I should have been able to see the elevator doors open and the man step out. But the camera was angled away from room 406, which was adjacent to the elevator area. And the slight shift in the camera's angle that had been happening over the past weeks meant that the frame also cut off slightly more of the elevator door area than it should have. I thought I saw a shape in the peripheral area of the frame, the kind of suggestion of movement at the edge of a camera's view. But I couldn't be certain. I went upstairs at 5:15. The fourth floor corridor was empty. The elevator doors were closed. I walked to room 406. I put my ear to the door, very faintly. Faintly enough that I told myself immediately it was the ventilation. The HVAC system running through the ducts in the walls. The building's infrastructure. It was a sound like low, even breathing. That's the only way I can describe it. The ventilation does make sounds that you might, if you were in the right state of mind, interpret that way. If you were tired, if you'd been sitting alone in a building for 10 hours, if you'd been priming yourself for weeks to find significance in small things. I took my ear off the door and went back to my desk. On the way down, I passed the south stairwell landing on 4. And I thought about the door on 5 being warm. I thought about the 2 cables labeled 5F-A and 5F-B running to the front desk. I thought about Paulette's slight head turn when the cameras came back. I thought about the man in the lobby chair watching the front doors for an hour. I went back to my desk. I opened my notebook. I wrote everything down, and then I did something that I had been not doing because it felt like crossing a particular threshold that, once crossed, would change my relationship to this job in a way I couldn't undo. I went to the front desk while Paulette was in the back room getting the morning pastry delivery sorted. I walked around to the working side of the front desk counter. I went to the end of the desk, where the dark monitor sat behind the decorative plant. I moved the plant aside and looked at the monitor. It was dark as it always was. The green power LED was lit as it always was. There was no label on the monitor itself. The cable running from its back disappeared behind the desk in the direction of the cable management area. I reached around to the back of the monitor and found the power button. I pressed it. The screen came on. It took about 5 seconds to initialize, and then I was looking at 2 camera feeds displayed in a split screen. The feeds were labeled in small text at the bottom corner of each half. The labels were in the same format as the cable management panel labels 5F-A and 5F-B. The feeds were grainy. The cameras they came from were not modern. They had the low-resolution, slightly greenish quality of older security camera hardware, possibly older than the rest of the system. 5F-A showed a wide corridor, not like the carpeted guest corridors on floors 1 through 4. A hard floor, some kind of sealed concrete or industrial tile, gray-toned in the camera's rendering. The corridor was wide, wider than the guest corridors, with what appeared to be pipes and conduit running along the ceiling. This was consistent with a mechanical floor. The corridor was lit, or there was at least some illumination that the camera could work with. A low ambient level that showed shapes without much detail. 5F-B showed a room, not a mechanical room. A room with a table in the center. A long table with several chairs around it, like a conference room, but without the corporate branding, without the projection screen, without the things that make a hotel conference room look like a hotel conference room. Just a table and chairs in a room with concrete walls. The room was empty. The corridor was empty. I stood there and looked at both feeds for probably 30 seconds. They were static in the sense that nothing moved in either of them. Then I heard Paulette's footsteps coming back from the back room. I reached around and pressed the power button on the monitor. The screen went dark. I moved the plant back and walked back to the security desk side of the room. When Paulette came back around the corner, she glanced at me. Not with surprise. With something that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite anything else I had a clean word for. She looked at me the way you look at something when you've anticipated it and you're managing your own reaction to it being confirmed. She said, "Restocking the pastry cart? You want anything before you head out?" I said, "No, thanks, I'm good." She went back to the front desk. I watched the security monitors. Neither of us said anything about the monitor, about what I'd obviously just been doing on the other side of the desk. I want to take a moment here to talk about what that means, because I think it's the most important thing I noticed in all of my time at the Carver. Not the camera outages, not the woman near 312, not the warm door on 5. The most important thing was Paulette's reaction. She had seen me looking at the monitor, she had recognized what I was doing, and she had chosen to give me a completely normal exit from the situation, an out, a way to pretend we'd both just had a brief and unremarkable overlap at the front desk. She wasn't covering for the hotel, or not only that, she was covering for me, like she understood that acknowledging what I'd done, what I'd seen, what I was thinking, would put me in a position she didn't want me to be in. Like she knew what happened when you acknowledged it, and she was extending the mercy of pretending I hadn't, or I'm reading too much into a tired woman's normal response to an employee she barely knows. I'm aware that's equally possible. But I thought about Kevin Spire. 43 nights. Asked Hoyt about the cameras, left. And I thought about the woman in his log, the guest in gray near 312, who I had now also seen near 312, 7 months later. I went home at 7:30 that morning because I'd stayed a little later than usual. And I sat in my car in the parking lot of my apartment building and I thought about what I was going to do. Not the abstract version of that question. The specific, practical version, what am I going to do? I could talk to Hoyt. I knew what that would get me. A variation on what he'd told me on night 1 and what he'd apparently told Kevin Spire. The building has a quirk. It's being looked at. Nothing to worry about. I could contact the agency that had placed me and flag the situation. This was legitimate, in theory. Security workers are supposed to be able to report concerns about their placements to the contracting agency without retaliation. In practice, the agency's interest was in maintaining the contract with the Carver, not in supporting the observations of an individual worker who was at a property for what was shaping up to be a limited tenure. I could go to the 5th floor. I did not have card access to the 5th floor. The card reader on that door used the same system as the room readers, which meant any card in the system with the right access could open it. My security key card had lobby level access, meaning it opened the staff areas on the ground floor. I did not have access above ground floor on my card, except that master keys in hotel systems sometimes have broader access than their designated level. The master key is intended to give security access to guest rooms and emergencies, but master keys are often given access to staff areas as well for practical reasons. Whether mine had access to the 5th floor card reader was something I had no way to know without trying. I went home. I slept. I came back. On the nights that followed, I want to describe something that's hard to describe because it's not a single event. It's a quality. It's what the job started to feel like in a way that was different from how it had felt before. Every night after I found the monitor at the front desk, the shift had a different character. I had always been watchful. That's the job. But this was something different from professional watchfulness. This was the feeling of being watched back. I want to be careful here, because I know that sounds like it's heading somewhere dramatic, and I want to stay inside what was real, what was experiential, and what I can actually document. Here are the specifics. The corridor cameras on 3 and 4 have small red indicator LEDs on the front of the housing that light up when the camera is actively recording. I had noticed these lights on my first week and paid them no more attention than you'd pay a street light. That they're there, they do their thing, you don't think about them. Starting in about week 5, I started noticing that the camera LEDs on the corridor cameras sometimes oriented differently to me as I walked past them on my circuit. This is a function of the viewing angle. The LED is directional, and depending on where you are relative to the camera, it can appear brighter or dimmer as the camera's housing shifts. Cameras sometimes have motors that make minor automated adjustments, and older cameras have a drift tendency where the housing slowly moves over time. The cameras in the Carver corridors had no motor. I had confirmed this early on because I'd looked up the model during a slow shift. But sometimes, when I was at the far end of a corridor, I would have the distinct impression that the camera at the near end had adjusted its angle since I'd last looked at it. Not a large movement, not one I could ever fully confirm, but the impression. I started walking the corridors the same way twice. Once forward, once back, paying specific attention to each camera. I wanted to catch one moving. I never did. Not directly. There was never a moment where I could say definitively that camera was pointing this way and now it is pointing that way. The impressions accumulated without ever crossing into proof. But there was one night, a Tuesday, when I was doing the circuit on 3, and I passed the South Corridor camera and looked up at it, and the LED was not lit. The recording indicator was off. I stood under the camera and looked up at it. The LED was dark. I went back to the security desk and looked at the 3rd floor South Corridor feed on the monitor. The feed was live. I could see the corridor on the monitor, including the area where I'd been standing. So the camera was recording. The feed was live. But the indicator, LED, on the camera housing was off. I went back up to 3 and stood under the camera again. The LED was still off. I went back to the desk. The feed was still showing. I was in the feed on the monitor. I stood in the corridor in the feed and waved my hand. The figure in the feed waved back. The LED on the camera housing was dark. I stood there in the corridor and I looked at the camera and the camera looked back at me, apparently because I was in its feed, but it was doing so without the indicator that said it was doing so, which meant either the LED had burned out, which happens, or something about the camera's recording state had changed in a way that disabled the indicator, or someone had disabled the indicator specifically. I wrote it in my notebook and I continued my circuit. I want to tell you about something that happened near the end of my time at the Carver, because I've been building toward it in this account, and I don't want to hold it any longer than I already have. It was a night in December, cold out, the parking lot wet and shining under the lot lights. The kind of night where the building feels genuinely sealed off, genuinely separate from the outside world. I had been at the Carver for about 2 months. I was on shift with Paulette as usual. At 1:45 a.m., I did my pre-outage circuit. I walked all 4 floors. Every corridor was empty. Every stairwell was clear. The pool gate was locked. The exterior doors were secure. At 2 a.m., I came back to the security desk. At 2:07 a.m., the cameras dropped. And at 2:07 a.m., I made the decision. I took my master key. I went to the south stairwell. I climbed to the 5th floor landing. I held the master key card up to the reader. The light on the reader went from red to green. The door clicked open. I pushed it and stepped through. The 5th floor smelled like old construction and something else underneath it. Something I couldn't name immediately and which I still don't have a perfect word for. It was a dry smell like the air in old institutional buildings, the kind of smell that exists in spaces that have their own internal circulation, separate from the public accessible areas of a building. The corridor was exactly what the camera had shown me. Wide, hard-floored, pipes and conduit running along the ceiling. There was ambient lighting, not overhead lights, but a series of low-mounted fixtures along the base of the walls, the kind of emergency path lighting you see in institutional corridors. It gave the space a dim, even illumination that showed everything without casting proper shadows. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Then I let the door close behind me and walked forward. The corridor extended the full length of the building, north to south, with several closed doors along each side. The doors were heavier than guest room doors, metal framed, each with a small wired glass window about halfway up, the old institutional kind you see in schools and hospitals, built in the mid-20th century. I looked through the windows as I passed. Most of the rooms appeared to be genuine mechanical and storage spaces. I could see HVAC equipment, water system components, rows of shelving with labeled boxes, exactly what a mechanical floor should have. But I was counting doors. I walked the length of the corridor, and I counted 11 doors. The building's footprint, if you translate it from the 4 guest floors below, would support roughly 18 to 22 rooms per floor. A mechanical floor with the same footprint would have distributed space differently, but 11 doors was fewer than I expected for the length of the corridor. At the far south end of the corridor, there was a turn. I hadn't seen a turn from the camera feed, but the camera had been positioned at the north end, and its view hadn't reached the south end completely. I went around the turn. There was a shorter cross corridor, maybe 30 feet long, with 3 doors. These doors were different. Not the wired glass institutional doors of the main corridor. These were flush steel doors with no window, no wired glass, just flat gray steel with a lever handle and a card reader on each one. I stood there and looked at these 3 doors. My master key had gotten me through the main entry door. Whether it would work on these doors was another question. I looked at the first door. I thought about what I would find on the other side. If I found nothing, another storage room, another mechanical space, I would have confirmed a plausible alternative to everything I'd been observing. If I found something else, I would have confirmed something that I didn't have a plan for. I was aware that the cameras were down. I was inside the window of the 207 outage. I didn't know exactly how long I had, because the outages had been running longer each time, and I had no reliable prediction, but based on the pattern, I had maybe 5 to 7 minutes from when I'd entered. I held the master key up to the reader on the first door. The light went green. I pushed the door open. It was the conference room from the camera feed. The one with the long table and the chairs. I could tell because the table matched what I'd seen on the 5F-B feed. The proportions, the plain quality of it. But from inside the room, I could things the camera hadn't shown me. The table had materials on it, papers mostly organized into stacks at each chair position, the way you'd set up a conference table for a meeting. I picked up the nearest stack and looked at it. It was printed text, not official looking, not corporate documents or hotel paperwork. The formatting was dense and informal, like something printed from a word processor without much attention to layout. The text was in English, and it appeared to be, at first glance, a kind of log. Dated entries, the way my own notebook was organized. I read the top entry. The date was 2 weeks ago. The entry read, in a handwriting that had been photocopied or scanned and printed. Midnight 44. Outage nominal, 712 duration. All quadrants confirmed. Room retention at 90%. One exterior departure noted and logged. Guest in 315 removed tray per schedule. Good? I read that several times. 7 minutes and 12 seconds. Room retention. One exterior departure. Guest in 315 removed tray per schedule. The tray outside 315 on my fifth night. The one I'd attributed to the guest setting it out during the camera window. It hadn't been set out during the window. It had been removed by someone during a previous outage and returned or something like that. And what was in room 315, or what the tray represented in this log, was something I was not going to have time to understand right now. I turned pages. I was moving fast, aware of the time, aware that at some point the cameras were going to come back, and I was going to need to be at my desk, or at least not on the 5th floor. Most of the entries in the log were technical and opaque, in the way that logs written by people who fully understand what they're doing are opaque to people who don't. References to quadrants, which I assumed corresponded to the 4 guest floors. References to retention, which I assumed meant something about the continued presence of something in the building. References to departure events, logged with room numbers and times. There was a page near the middle that was different from the others, less like a log, more like a note or a letter. It was longer than the other entries, and the tone was different, less technical. I'm going to tell you what it said as closely as I can reconstruct it, because I only had time to read it once, and I was in a state of very focused attention that I don't think is the same thing as memory. It said approximately, for anyone reviewing this record, the schedule was established before the current management structure and exists independently of any individual employee's knowledge. The operational window at 0207 is not a malfunction and should not be reported as one. The duration increases are within normal parameters for this phase. The guests in retention have been here in various configurations for longer than the hotel's current operational history. They are not guests in the hospitality sense. The term was adopted for internal record-keeping consistency. The staff who interact with the schedule are not required to understand it fully. They are required to log their observations and not interfere with the window. Previous security personnel who interfered with the window have been relocated. This is not a threat. Relocation is administrative. Please do not be on 5 during the window. I put the papers down. I looked at the room. I looked at the chairs around the table. I looked at the stacks of papers at each chair position. 11 positions. I counted without meaning to. 1 for each of the main corridor doors I'd passed. I looked at the door I'd come in through, which I'd let fall closed behind me. I looked at the clock on my phone. It was 2:13 a.m. The outage should have ended by now. Based on the recent pattern, 7 to 8 minutes. I'd entered the stairwell at 2:07, come upstairs, spent time in the corridor, been in this room for what felt like 3 minutes but was probably 5. The camera should be back. I went to the door and opened it. I went back up the cross corridor to the main corridor. I went to the north end and the door to the stairwell. I pushed through and went down the stairs, moving quickly, but not running. The way you move when you need to get somewhere faster than normal without looking like you're fleeing. I came back to the security desk at 2:16. I sat down. I looked at the monitors. The feeds were live. All 16 showing the corridors, the lobby, the parking lots, everything quiet. 2:16 a.m. Paulette was at the front desk. She didn't look up. I looked at my notebook. I didn't open it. I just looked at it sitting on the desk. Please do not be on 5 during the window. I thought about the duration of the outage. If the outage had ended at its usual time, 7 or 8 minutes, then it had ended around 2:14 or 2:15, which meant the cameras had been live for maybe a minute before I got back to my desk, which meant there had been a minute of live feed with no one at the security desk. I looked at the lobby camera. The lobby was empty. I looked at the 4th floor north corridor camera. The corridor was empty. I looked at the 3rd floor south corridor camera. There was someone in the corridor, near the south stairwell door, just inside the frame, at the far edge of where the camera's view reached. It was a figure in gray, standing still, facing the stairwell door. I watched for about 30 seconds. The figure didn't move. Then the south stairwell door on 3 opened from the inside, and the figure went through it and the door fell closed. I sat there with my hands flat on the desk. The south stairwell on 3 connects, going up to the south stairwell on 4, and then to the 5th floor landing. I did not go to the stairwell. I did not get up from the desk. I wrote in my notebook with a hand that was entirely steady, which I noted because I expected it to shake and it didn't. And what I wrote was the time and what I'd seen and the direction of travel. And then I sat there until 7 a.m. when the day shift came in, and I drove home, and I sat in my car in the parking lot for a long time. Over the following week, I kept showing up. I want to explain that, and I'm not sure I fully can. I kept showing up because I needed the income, and because leaving abruptly would have meant explaining why, and because some part of me, the part that has been doing this kind of work for 6 years and is not easily frightened, was not ready to accept that I didn't understand what was happening. I had a piece of the answer. The document I'd read in the 5th floor conference room gave me a frame. The window at 207 was not a malfunction. The guests in retention had been in the building for longer than the hotel's current operational history. The duration increases were within normal parameters for this phase. What was this phase? What was retention? What happened to security workers who interfered with the window? Previous security personnel who interfered with the window have been relocated. This is not a threat. Relocation is administrative. I thought about Kevin Spire, 43 nights. Left. Was leaving the job what they meant by relocated? Had Kevin Spire simply quit? Or been let go? Or been moved to another position, and was that the relocation administrative? Moved from one placement to another, the way the agency moves contractors between properties when things aren't working out? I thought about the man in the lobby chair, sitting perfectly still for over an hour, watching the front doors. I thought about the woman near 312 in gray. I thought about the figure on the monitor who went through the south stairwell door and headed upward. I thought about what the document meant by guests in the hospitality sense. The guests who were not guests in the hospitality sense had been in the hotel in various configurations for longer than the hotel's current operational history. How long had the Carver been operating? I looked it up. The building had been a hotel for 27 years. Before that, from what I could find, it had been a commercial office building. Before that, the property records showed industrial use going back further than I bothered to trace. What does it mean to say that something has been in a building for longer than the building's operational history? I don't know. I genuinely don't know. And I have been sitting with that, not knowing for long enough that I've stopped expecting it to resolve into something clean. What I can tell you is what I observed in the final nights I worked at the Carver. The outage durations had been increasing. In the last week, they were running consistently between 8 and 10 minutes. I timed them precisely. 2:07 to 2:15 or 2:17. Every night. On the second to last night I was there, the outage ran 12 minutes. When the feeds came back, all 16 monitors were live for about 4 seconds, and then 3 of them went dark again. Not static, just dark. The 3rd floor north camera, the 4th floor south camera, and the lobby camera. They went dark for about 40 seconds and then came back. In those 40 seconds, I did not see what the lobby camera showed when it came back. I did not see the figure that I think was there, based on the peripheral image caught by the conference room corridor camera before it went dark. I cannot confirm what I thought I saw in those 4 seconds before the second dropout. I wrote it in my notebook. On the last night I worked at the Carver, I arrived at 11 p.m. for my shift. I went to the security desk, I set up my notebooks, my phone, my coffee. I did my 11 p.m. circuit, I came back to the desk. At 11:45 p.m., Hoyt came in. He was not usually at the hotel at 11:45 p.m. He was a day manager. He came in through the staff entrance, which I knew because the external door alarm chirped when the staff door opened and he appeared from the corridor behind me. He said, "Marcus, got a minute?" I said, "Sure." He said, "Why don't we step into the filing room?" We went into the filing room. He closed the door. He stood with one hand on the top of the filing cabinet, not looking at it, looking at me. He said, "I heard you've been asking around about the building. Sandra mentioned you were curious about the upper floors." I said, "Just getting familiar with the property." He said, "Sure." He nodded slowly. "That's good. That's the right instinct. You want to know what you're working with?" He looked at the filing cabinet, then back at me. "The thing is, we have some areas of the property that are handled through a separate channel, facilities and building management. And when security staff start engaging with those areas, it can create some confusion that's hard to untangle." I said, "I haven't been in any restricted areas." He said, "I know." He said it in a way that might have meant, "I believe you," or might have meant, "I know because I know exactly what you've been doing and you don't need to elaborate." He said, "I just want to make sure you're comfortable here, that you're getting what you need from the position." I said, "I'm good." He said, "Good." He straightened up. "Because we've had some turnover in this role, and I don't love that. I'd like someone who's settled in, who gets the routine." I said, "I get the routine." He looked at me for a moment. He picked up a stapler from the top of the filing cabinet, looked at it, put it down. He said, "The 207 thing." I waited. He said, "It's going to keep doing that. It's not going away. Best thing to do is log it, note the duration, and move on. That's all you need to do. That's all anyone needs to do." I said, "Okay." He said, "You're not going to go looking into it." It wasn't a question. It was the space where a question would go, shaped like one, but not actually asking anything, more like finishing a sentence together. I said, "No." He said, "Good." He put his hand briefly on my shoulder in the way a manager does when he's trying to be collegial and doesn't quite know how. "You're good at this job. Keep doing it." He left. I heard the staff door chirp again when he went out. I sat at the security desk. I looked at the monitors. I looked at the time. It was 12:20 a.m. I thought about what he'd said. The 207 thing, not the camera glitch, not the outage. The 207 thing, like it was just a feature of the building, like the slow elevator or the lobby fireplace that doesn't actually run. The 207 thing. I did my circuit at 1 a.m. I walked all 4 floors. Every corridor was quiet. Occupied rooms had the soft underdoor light of television screens. The vending alcoves hummed. The ice machines sat silent because no one was using them. At the end of the 4th floor corridor, I stood at the north stairwell and I listened to the building for a moment. The ventilation, the distant traffic, attenuated by the walls and the winter air. The particular hum that buildings make at night, their electrical systems and their plumbing and their infrastructure all doing their work at low register, just under the threshold of conscious hearing, the sound you don't notice until you actively listen. And underneath that, it's something I'd been hearing for weeks and processing as building noise, and am still not entirely certain was anything else. A slow, rhythmic sound, not quite regular. The way something breathing is not quite regular. Coming from above the ceiling of the 4th floor corridor. From the floor above. I went back to my desk. At 2 a.m., I did the pre-outage circuit. I went through every floor. Everything was exactly as it should be. I came back to the desk at 2:05. I sat down. At 2:07 a.m., the feeds dropped. I sat there in the static and I watched the monitors. I counted. I got to 50, 100, 150. At 150, the static on the monitors changed, not to a live feed, something else. One of the 16 feeds, specifically the camera for the 4th floor north corridor, showed something different from static. It showed at very low resolution and with significant noise in the image, a view of a corridor. Not the 4th floor north corridor, a different corridor. The floors were different. The lighting was different. The same low path lighting I'd seen on 5. The camera was showing me a live feed from the 5th floor. I looked at the 5th floor corridor on the monitor for maybe 20 seconds. The corridor was empty. Then it wasn't. A figure came into the frame at the far end of the corridor, walking slowly toward the camera. The resolution was too low to see details. The figure was upright, walking at a human pace in the path-lit corridor of the 5th floor. It walked toward the camera and stopped about midway. It stood there. I looked at it. It stood there. I looked at it for 60 seconds, which felt like significantly longer. Then the feed cut back to static. And then, at a count of somewhere around 200 from when the outage started, the feeds restored. All 16 of them live. The corridors and the lobby and the parking lots. Everything exactly as it should be at 2:10 in the morning in a hotel that is mostly empty in the winter. I sat at the desk and breathed. I wrote in my notebook, 2:07, 3+ minute outage. 4N camera showed 5th floor corridor during outage. Figure present standing. Resolution insufficient for identification. Return to live feed at approximately 2:10. I held the pen over the page for a moment, and then I wrote, the feed was not showing me the 5th floor for my benefit. I don't know whose benefit it was for, but I don't think it was mine. I did my 3 a.m. circuit. I did my 4 a.m. circuit. I sat at the desk and watched the monitors and wrote nothing else in the notebook because there was nothing else to write. At 6:45 a.m., Sandra came in for the morning shift. She was carrying a coffee in each hand, which was unusual. She didn't usually bring two. She set one on the security desk in front of me. She said, "Rough night?" I said, "Not bad." She looked at the monitors. She looked at my notebook, which was closed on the desk. She said, "You look tired." I said, "I'm always tired." She said, "Yeah." She picked up her coffee. You know, there's a day security position that opened up at the airport property, the Marriott on the North Terminal access, if you're interested in moving around. I looked at her. She was looking at the monitors. I said, "Did someone tell you to mention that?" She said, "No, I just heard about it. Thought you might want to change. Day shifts are better." I said, "Yeah." I finished logging my shift. I initialed the last entry in the paper log. I put on my jacket. I picked up my notebook and put it in my pocket. On my way out, I passed the front desk. Paulette was finishing her handoff notes for Sandra. She looked up when I passed. She said, "Have a good morning, Marcus." I said, "You too, Paulette." She held my eyes for a fraction of a second. Not the nervous, uncertain fraction of a second. Something else. Something that communicated a lot of things at once. None of them clearly, all of them in the register of one person trying to convey something to another person that falls outside the vocabulary of normal workplace exchange. I think what she was trying to say was, "I'm sorry," or possibly, "I'm glad you're going," or possibly, "It doesn't change anything, you know that." Wherever you go, some version of this is going to be a wall you run into eventually, and whether you stay or go, the window at 207 is going to open tonight the same way it opened last night and the night before. The building has its routine. I said goodbye to Paulette and walked out through the glass front doors of the Carver extended stay and suites into a cold December morning with no snow, but the sky, suggesting it was thinking about it. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a long time. I thought about the document on the 5th floor table, the guests who were not guests in the hospitality sense, in various configurations for longer than the hotel's current operational history. I thought about the figure in the 4th floor north corridor camera on my 6th night, standing near the ice machine, completely still. I thought about the woman in gray near room 312. I thought about the man in the lobby chair, watching the front doors for an hour at 4 o'clock in the morning. I thought about what they were waiting for, whether waiting is even the right word for whatever they were doing. I thought about what the hotel provided for them. Not rooms, not service. Something that I don't have the vocabulary for. Something that the document I'd read tried to describe in its bureaucratic way and didn't quite get there. Something that required a window of time at 2:07 a.m., a window that was expanding, a window that the building apparently facilitated as reliably as it facilitated the elevator or the ice machines or the heating system. I thought about the note in Kevin Spire's log, starting to think I should log it somewhere else. That's what this is. That's what I'm doing. I didn't take the airport property job. I took a different placement, a residential tower on the east side of the city. Day shifts. I sleep at night now like a normal person. Or I try to. I still have the notebook. I've read through it enough times that certain pages are softer than others from handling. I know what it says. I know what I wrote, and I know what it represents in terms of evidence, which is nothing official, nothing I could take to anyone and have taken seriously. It's a security worker's personal log from a mid-tier hotel. It documents things I noticed and things I thought, and one very inadvisable trip through an unlocked door. What I didn't document, what I can't document, is what I felt on the last night at the security desk when the 4th floor north corridor camera showed me the 5th floor, and the figure in the corridor stood there for 60 seconds while I watched it. What I felt wasn't fear exactly, or not only fear, it was the feeling of being included in something, of being shown something deliberately. The feed had switched for 60 seconds. The figure had stood in the frame long enough to establish presence, and then it had ended. Not a warning, not a threat. Something closer to acknowledgement. Like whatever was being observed through those cameras had decided at some point in the preceding weeks to to observe back, and had chosen one moment on what turned out to be my last night to let that be mutual. I don't know what was in room 406. I don't know who the woman in gray was. I don't know what the 11 doors on the 5th floor contained behind the wired glass, or what the 3 steel doors with no windows contained, or what the table in the conference room was for and who sat at those 11 chairs and what they discussed. I don't know whether the 207 window was always 2 minutes or whether it was always heading toward what it had become by the time I was there. I don't know how long it has been opening and what it has been in the language of the document retaining. I know that the Carver extended stay in suites is still operating. I drove past it once a few months after I stopped working there. The parking lot was full, cars in every space. The gas fireplace in the lobby was visible through the glass front doors, actually running this time, casting that orange warmth into the lobby that makes a hotel lobby look like somewhere you'd want to be on a cold night. I know that every night at 2:07 a.m., the security cameras lose signal simultaneously. I know the outage lasts for some number of minutes that has been growing by a predictable increment. I know that whoever is sitting at the security desk right now, if it is 2:07 and the static is on every monitor, is sitting in the dark on their screens and listening to the building make its sounds, and either writing it up as a known quirk or sitting very still and understanding that the hotel is not malfunctioning. The hotel is doing exactly what it has always done. At 2:07 a.m., in the dark, in the silence that is not quite silence, in the building that hums to itself in frequencies you don't consciously hear, the window opens, and whatever comes through it, or whatever uses it, or whatever has been using it since before the Carver was called the Carver or was a hotel at all, it goes about its routine the same way we go about ours. The only difference is we notice ours. I'm not sure they do. I drove to work this morning in the dark, the way I always do now, even on the day shift, because it's winter and the sun comes up late. The route takes me past a stretch of the commercial access road, a long, flat road with parking lot lighting on both sides, the kind of road that could be anywhere in America, the kind of road that has 3 mid-tier hotels on it in the space of half a mile. I didn't look at them directly, but in my peripheral vision as I drove past, I saw the sign for one of them, the parking lot, the glass front doors of the lobby lit from within. I checked the time. It was 2:06 a.m. I kept driving.